Everyone laughed when this teen walked into court. Seconds later, he left the judge speechless. The courtroom was packed. People whispered, smirked, exchanged knowing glances. They had already made up their minds the moment he stepped in. A young black teenager, walking into a courtroom full of people who didn't believe in him, who had already judged him before he even spoke a single word. It wasn't just about the case. No, it was about something much deeper. The system, the way things had always been, the unspoken rules that had existed for generations. And yet, in just a few moments, he would change everything. He walked in, shoulders straight, his face calm, but his eyes held a quiet storm. He had been here before, not in this courtroom, not in front of this judge, but in situations just like this. Situations where people like him were expected to fail, where the color of his skin spoke before he even had a chance to open his mouth. The laughter, he had heard it before. The disbelief, he had lived with it. The weight of history pressed down on him, but he refused to bow. The judge, an older white man with years of experience, sat behind his high desk, peering down at him through his glasses. He had seen kids like this before, at least. That's what he thought. A young black teenager, caught up in the system, probably another statistic. He cleared his throat, ready to move things along, because in his mind, he already knew where this was going. But he didn't know this boy. The prosecutor, a well-dressed white man with a smirk that barely hid his condescension, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. He had built his case on more than just evidence. He had built it on assumptions, on history, on a world where people like him always won, and people like the boy standing before him always lost. The defense attorney sat beside the teen, looking tense. He had warned him about this. He had told him how this would go, how they would look at him, how they would treat him. But the boy wasn't listening to that. He was listening to something deeper. When the judge asked him to speak, the courtroom fell silent. The murmurs, the laughter, the whispers, they all stopped. No one expected much. No one thought his words would matter. But the moment he opened his mouth, everything changed. His voice was steady, strong. He spoke not just for himself, but for every person who had stood where he stood. He didn't just talk about the case. He talked about the reality behind it. He painted a picture so vivid, so undeniable, that even those who had come in with their minds made up began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. He spoke of the history they didn't want to acknowledge, the truths they had spent lifetimes ignoring. He laid out the facts. But more than that, he laid out the truth, the raw, painful truth that no one wanted to hear. The judge's expression changed. The prosecutor's smirk faded. The audience, the same people who had laughed when he walked in, now sat in stunned silence. Because this wasn't just a case anymore. This was a reckoning. And then, as the boy finished speaking, he did something no one expected. He looked the judge straight in the eyes and said the words that would haunt that courtroom forever. The room was frozen in silence. The laughter that had filled the courtroom minutes ago had vanished, replaced by an unsettling tension that pressed against everyone's chest. The boy stood there, unwavering, his presence demanding attention in a way that no one had expected. He wasn't just another black teenager in court. He was something more. He was a mirror, forcing them all to look at the truths they had ignored for far too long. And as he held the judge's gaze, the weight of history seemed to settle in that room, as if every injustice, every unspoken bias, every whispered prejudice had suddenly been dragged into the open. The judge shifted in his chair, his once confident posture faltering under the intensity of the moment. He had been on this bench for years, had seen countless cases, had sentenced men and women without a second thought. But this was different. The boy's words had shattered the illusion of impartiality, had ripped apart the carefully constructed narrative that the justice system was fair, that it treated everyone equally. The judge opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in his long career, he found himself at a loss. The prosecutor, who had sat so smugly before, now looked uncomfortable. His fingers clenched around his pen, his jaw tight, as he stared down at his notes, as if trying to find something, anything, that could undo the damage the boy's words had caused. But there was nothing, because this wasn't just about evidence, about legal arguments, about guilt or innocence. This was about the truth. And the truth was something he had never prepared for. The audience, filled with people who had come expecting to see another black kid stumble over his words, another easy conviction, now sat in stunned silence. Some shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to acknowledge the discomfort curling in their stomachs. Others leaned forward, captivated, caught between disbelief and an undeniable, growing respect, because they had seen something rare, something powerful, a young black boy standing in a room designed to break him and refusing to bend. The boy took a slow breath before he spoke again. This time, his voice was even stronger, filled with something that sent chills down spines, conviction. He told them about the reality of walking through a world that judged him before he even spoke. How, since he was a child, he had been taught to be careful in ways that his white peers never had to be. How he had learned to lower his voice, to keep his hands visible in stores, to move slowly when reaching for his wallet. How his mother had sat him down at just 10 years old and told him that no matter how good he was, no matter how smart or kind, there would always be people who saw him as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The judge's hands clenched. His eyes darted away, as if looking at the boy for too long might force him to face something he wasn't ready to confront. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. And the jury, oh, the jury, a mix of men and women, mostly white, who had walked into that courtroom believing in the justice system, believing in the stories they had always been told about fairness, about law and order, about how things worked. But now doubt was creeping in. Now, cracks were forming in the foundation of their beliefs. The boy didn't stop. He spoke of the numbers, the statistics that proved what so many denied. How black men were sentenced more harshly than their white counterparts for the same crimes. How juries, overwhelmingly white, were more likely to convict black defendants. How police officers were trained to see black boys as older, as more dangerous, as threats before they even had a chance to prove otherwise. He laid it all out, piece by piece, fact by fact, stripping away the lies that had been told for generations. Someone in the audience shifted, clearing their throat, the weight of the truth too much to sit with in silence. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her lips pressed together as if holding back a sob. A man crossed his arms, his jaw tight, unwilling to let himself feel the emotions creeping in. But the boy saw it. He saw the way the room had changed, the way the air had thickened with something unspoken, something undeniable. Then he did something no one expected. He turned to the prosecutor, meeting his gaze with a calmness that shook the man to his core. And then he asked the question, "Would I be here if I were white?" The words cut through the room like a blade, sharp and merciless. The prosecutor flinched, his carefully crafted confidence crumbling. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat, because the truth was right there, staring him in the face, and there was no argument, no slick legal maneuver, no well-rehearsed statement that could make it go away. The judge exhaled, long and slow, his hands pressing against the desk as if steadying himself. He had seen thousands of cases, but none like this. None where a defendant had turned the courtroom against itself, had taken the very foundation of the system and forced it to look in the mirror. He knew the boy was right. He had always known, deep down, but knowing and acknowledging were two different things. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then, from the back of the room, a single clap. Slow, deliberate. Then another, and another, until suddenly the room erupted, not in laughter, not in jeers, but in applause. Not everyone clapped. Some still sat in stiff silence, refusing to be moved. But enough did. Enough to shake the walls of that courtroom, to make the judge look down at the papers before him and realize that whatever decision he made, this moment would never be forgotten. The boy stood there unshaken, because he knew, regardless of the outcome, he had already won. The claps echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the wooden walls like the sound of something shattering, something old, something ugly, something that had been held together by silence for far too long. The boy didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't bask in the sudden shift of energy. He just stood there, waiting, watching, knowing that applause wasn't enough. Applause was easy. Change was hard. And in this room, in this moment, change was staring every single person in the face. daring them to look away. The judge lifted a hand, and the room slowly quieted, but the energy didn't disappear. It lingered, thick and electric, pressing against the walls like something alive. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against the edge of his table, as if he wanted to object, but couldn't quite find the right words. Because what could he say? That the boy was wrong? That the numbers didn't exist? That history wasn't what it was? He knew better. They all did. The boy finally turned his gaze back to the judge, unflinching, unwavering. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You have the power to decide my fate. But what you really have in your hands is something much bigger than me. You have a choice. You can be what people expect you to be, or you can be better." The judge's breath hitched, just for a second. He shifted in his seat, staring down at the papers in front of him as if they could offer him an escape, an answer, something easier than the reality sitting right in front of him. But there was nothing, just the truth, just the weight of a system that had been built long before he ever sat on that bench, a system that had crushed boys like the one standing before him without hesitation, without remorse, without second thoughts. He could feel the eyes on him, hundreds of them, the jury, the audience, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads. But none of their eyes were as piercing as the boy's. The boy who had walked into this courtroom knowing exactly how the world saw him and who had dared to challenge it anyway. The defense attorney finally spoke, clearing his throat. His voice was measured, controlled, but there was an urgency beneath it, something almost pleading. "Your Honor, my client has done nothing wrong. The evidence proves it. The testimony proves it. But we all know that, in too many cases like this, proof isn't enough. It should be. It has to be. If we are to believe that justice means anything, then today, in this courtroom, we must prove it." The judge's fingers drummed against the desk. His face remained unreadable, but something had cracked beneath the surface. The prosecutor shifted again, his confidence eroding. He had built his case on assumptions, on expectations, on a world where black boys were guilty the moment they were born. But now, that world was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to hold on to it. The boy spoke again. "I wasn't supposed to fight back. I wasn't supposed to stand here and tell you what you already know. I was supposed to be quiet. I was supposed to accept what was coming to me. But I won't. I can't. Because if I do, then nothing changes. And I refuse to let that happen." A woman in the back sniffled, dabbing at her eyes. A man next to her shifted uncomfortably, as if the words were pressing against something inside him he didn't want to confront. The room felt different now, like a weight had been lifted, but another had been placed in its place. Because now, the truth was out in the open, and the question wasn't whether they could see it. The question was whether they were brave enough to face it. The judge leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, his fingers steepled in front of him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than before. "Son," he said, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his tone, no superiority, just something that sounded almost like hesitation, like realization. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do?" The boy didn't hesitate. "I'm asking you to do what's right." The judge exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for the briefest moment. When he opened them again, something had shifted in them, something deep. He turned to the jury, his voice steady, but there was something beneath it now, something heavier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have heard the arguments. You have heard the testimony. You have heard the truth. Now it is time for justice to speak." The jury was escorted out to deliberate, but the tension in the room didn't break. It only grew. The prosecutor rubbed his temple, his leg bouncing beneath the table. The defense attorney leaned back, his jaw tight. The boy sat down, but his posture didn't relax. He had done what he came to do. Now, it was in the hands of people who had never had to carry the weight of injustice on their backs. And that was the hardest part. Minutes passed, then an hour. The courtroom remained full, no one daring to leave, as if the very air itself held them in place. The reporters whispered among themselves, their pens still scratching against their notepads. The boy's family sat together, holding hands, their grip tight, their breath shallow. Then the door opened. The jury filed back in, and in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The judge looked at the foreman, his expression unreadable. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged white man who had spent the entire trial with his arms crossed, his face impassive, nodded. We have, Your Honor. The bailiff took the slip of paper from the foreman's hand and walked it over to the judge. The judge unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. For the longest moment, he didn't move. Then, finally, he spoke. In the case of the state versus boy's name, on the charge of... He paused, glancing down again before lifting his gaze to the jury. How do you find the defendant? The foreman straightened, cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was clear. Not guilty. A gasp rippled through the room. Some people cheered. Some people cried. Some people sat there, stunned, unable to process what had just happened. The prosecutor's face drained of color. The defense attorney exhaled sharply, relief washing over him like a wave. And the boy, he didn't react. Not at first. Because this wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about one verdict. This was about something bigger. Something that had been a long time coming. The judge looked at him, something almost like respect in his eyes. You're free to go. The boy nodded, standing slowly. His family rushed to him, wrapping him in their arms, their tears hot against his skin. But even as he held them, even as he felt their relief, he knew this was only the beginning. Because he had done something bigger than winning a case. He had made them listen. He had made them see. And in a world where the truth had been ignored for so long that was everything. The courtroom doors swung open, and the boy stepped out, his feet moving slowly, as if the weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in. The hallway outside was lined with reporters, their cameras flashing, microphones stretching forward like eager hands grasping for a piece of his story. His family surrounded him, their presence a shield, but the moment still felt overwhelming, surreal. He had walked into this building expecting to be swallowed whole by a system that had devoured so many before him, and yet here he was free. But freedom wasn't just about walking out of this courthouse. Freedom wasn't just about this one victory, because outside these walls, there were still boys like him, still sitting in cold cells, still waiting for justice that might never come. A reporter called out his name, her voice sharp and insistent. How does it feel to prove them wrong? He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. Prove them wrong? Was that what this was? Had he proved anything at all? Had the jury's decision changed the way the world worked? Or had they just been too afraid to make the wrong call this time? His lips pressed together, and he shook his head, stepping past her without a word. There was nothing to say. Not yet. Outside, the air was thick, the city buzzing around him as though nothing had happened. People walked past, unaware, uncaring, wrapped up in their own lives. But here, on these courthouse steps, history had just been made. Not because a black boy had been found not guilty, but because, for once, the truth had been undeniable. The world had been forced to look at him, not as a stereotype, not as a statistic, but as a human being. His mother gripped his hand, squeezing it tightly. He could feel her trembling. She had spent sleepless nights praying for this moment, crying over the possibility that today might have gone another way. His father stood beside her, his face unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with something deeper than pride, relief, exhaustion, a kind of quiet rage that came from knowing that none of this should have happened in the first place. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and his lawyer gestured toward it. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm but firm. The boy nodded, stepping forward, but before he could reach the door, another voice rang out from the crowd. "You got lucky, kid. Don't forget that." He stopped mid-step. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even threatening. It was just there. Cold. Matter of fact. As if the speaker genuinely believed that luck had anything to do with this. He turned, scanning the faces in the crowd, until he found the man who had spoken. A middle-aged white man in a suit, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression neutral, unreadable. He wasn't part of the media. He wasn't part of the legal teams. He was just an observer, someone who had watched the trial unfold and had drawn his own conclusions. The boy met his gaze, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, the boy said, I didn't get lucky. I got justice. There's a difference." The man's lips curled slightly, something between a smirk and a sneer. "Justice," he repeated. "We'll see how long that lasts." The boy's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? This man, and so many like him, were waiting. Waiting for him to slip up. Waiting for him to make a mistake. Waiting for him to become exactly what they had expected him to be. He turned away, climbing into the SUV, without another word. As the door shut behind him, the world outside became muffled, distant. His mother exhaled, shakily beside him. His father remained silent, staring straight ahead. His lawyer rubbed his temples, exhausted. The car pulled away from the curb, and for the first time since the verdict had been read, the boy allowed himself to lean back, to breathe. The city blurred past the windows, the lights streaking together. He had spent the last few weeks in a battle he hadn't chosen, fighting against forces that had decided his fate before he had ever spoken a word. And now he was free. But freedom, real freedom, was still out of reach. Because even as he sat here, his name was still being debated in newsrooms, his face still being dissected on television screens, his story still being twisted into whatever version best suited the people telling it. Some would call him a hero. Others would call him a liar. Some would say he had beaten the system. Others would say the system had failed. But he knew the truth. He hadn't beaten anything. The system was still there, still waiting, still sharpening its teeth for the next black boy who dared to stand where he had stood. The car turned a corner, and for the first time, he saw where they were headed, home. A place he hadn't been in what felt like forever. His stomach twisted. Would it feel the same? Would he feel the same? Could he just walk through that door and pretend like the last few months hadn't changed him? The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, and before he could even step out, the door swung open. His little sister ran toward him, her eyes wide, her arms outstretched. "You're back," she squealed, throwing herself at him. He caught her, holding her tightly as she buried her face in his chest. He could feel her shaking. She had been too young to understand everything, but she had known enough to be afraid. His mother placed a hand on his back, her touch warm and steady. "Come inside," she whispered. "You're home now." Home. The word felt strange. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of his mother's cooking wrapping around him like a blanket. The walls, the furniture, the pictures, they were all the same. And yet, everything felt different. He felt different. He sat down on the couch, his body sinking into the cushions. His father sat across from him, his face still unreadable. "You did good today," he finally said. The boy looked down at his hands. "Did I?" His father nodded slowly. "You stood up for yourself. For all of us." Silence stretched between them. Then, his father leaned forward, his voice low. "But this isn't the end. You know that, don't you?" The boy swallowed hard. He did know. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. Because no matter how many times justice won, there would always be people waiting to take it away. His little sister curled up beside him, her tiny fingers clutching his sleeve. "You're safe now, right?" she asked softly. He hesitated. Then finally he nodded. "Yeah," he lied. "I'm safe." Outside, the world kept moving. The news kept running. The people kept talking. But in this house, for this moment, there was peace. And he held on to it. Because tomorrow, the fight would begin all over again.